Jake stood at the window of his quarters, staring out at the massive space station that floated in the darkness. Zenith 7 was unlike anything he had ever seen. The station was enormous, larger than any city on Earth, with thousands of ships docked at its many ports. Lights flickered across its surface like stars, and Jake could see dozens of different alien species moving through the transparent walkways that connected the various sections. He had been in space for 3 months now, but this was different. This was humanity's first real attempt at joining the galaxy's major powers. Everything had to go perfectly. Jake adjusted his uniform and checked his appearance one more time. As a lieutenant commander in Earth's newly formed Diplomatic Security Division, he was responsible for protecting Ambassador Helen Vance during the negotiations. It was a huge responsibility for someone who had been in the military for only 6 years, but Earth needed people who could adapt quickly to new situations. The door chimed, and Jake turned to see Commander Lisa Harper, the head of the security team, standing in the doorway. "Ready for the welcome ceremony?" she asked. Jake nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be. Have you seen the size of the delegation?" Lisa smiled grimly. 47 officials, each one more important than the last, according to their protocols. The ambassador has been studying their customs for weeks. Just remember, don't make direct eye contact with anyone wearing purple robes, don't speak unless spoken to, and for the love of Earth, don't touch anyone. "Great," Jake muttered. "This should be fun." The welcome ceremony was held in a massive hall near the center of the station. The room was designed to accommodate multiple species, with varying levels of gravity, atmosphere, and lighting in different sections. The human delegation stood in their assigned area, watching as the officials entered in precise formation. They were tall and slender, with pale blue skin and large dark eyes. They wore elaborate robes covered in symbols that Jake couldn't read. Each one moved with careful, measured steps, as if every gesture had been practiced 1,000 times. Ambassador Vance stood at the front of the human group, her face calm and professional. She was a career diplomat who had spent decades negotiating treaties on Earth before volunteering for this assignment. If anyone could navigate the complex web of galactic politics, it was her. The ceremony itself was long and boring. Speech after speech in languages Jake didn't understand, translated through his earpiece with a slight delay that made everything feel disconnected. He tried to pay attention, but after the 7th official began speaking about the ancient traditions of trade and cooperation, Jake found his mind wandering. That's when he noticed her. She stood near the edge of the hall, away from the main group of. Unlike the others, she wore simple clothes, a plain gray tunic and dark pants. No elaborate robes, no symbols of rank. She looked like a servant or maybe a low-level station worker. But there was something about the way she carried herself that caught Jake's attention. She stood with perfect posture, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the ceremony with an expression that seemed both interested and amused. Her features were striking, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Jake looked away, reminding himself to focus on his job. But he found his gaze drifting back to her several times during the ceremony. She never seemed to move, never seemed to fidget or show any sign of boredom, even though the speeches droned on for over 2 hours. Finally, the ceremony ended. The officials filed out in the same careful formation they had entered with, and the human delegation was led to a reception area where refreshments had been prepared. Jake followed Ambassador Vance, scanning the room for potential security threats out of habit. The reception was less formal than the ceremony, but not by much. Small groups of aliens stood in clusters, speaking in low voices. The humans stayed together, unsure of how to approach anyone without breaking some unknown rule of etiquette. Jake grabbed a drink from a passing server and moved to the edge of the room, giving himself a better view of the exits. That's when he saw her again. The woman in the simple clothes stood near a large window, looking out at the stars. Before he could stop himself, Jake walked over to her. Maybe it was the stress of the formal ceremony, or maybe he just needed to talk to someone who didn't look like they would report him for breathing wrong. Either way, he found himself standing next to her at the window. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing at the view. The woman turned to look at him, and Jake was struck by how bright her eyes were. She studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Yes, it is," she said. Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent Jake couldn't quite place. "This is your first time at Zenith 7. First time anywhere like this, Jake admitted. We're still pretty new to all of this, the whole galaxy thing, I mean. I've heard about your species, the woman said. Earth, correct, a planet with very high gravity and extreme weather patterns. That's one way to describe it, Jake said with a laugh. We call it home. Do you enjoy it, being so far from home? Jake thought about that for a moment. It's exciting, scary sometimes. There's so much we don't know, so many ways we could mess this up. But yeah, I guess I do enjoy it. It's better than wondering what's out here. The woman nodded thoughtfully. And what do you think of the... Jake glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Honestly, they seem a bit rigid. All those rules and protocols. I understand the importance of respect and tradition, but it feels like they're more concerned with how things look than with actually getting to know us. Perhaps they are cautious, the woman suggested. New species can be unpredictable. Maybe, Jake said, but you can't build trust without taking some risks, right? The woman's smile widened slightly. An interesting philosophy. Tell me, do you know me? Jake blinked, confused by the question. I'm sorry, what? Do you know me? She repeated. Have we met before? No, I don't think so, Jake said. I'm Jake, by the way, Lieutenant Commander with the security team. I know who you are, the woman said, but you don't know who I am. Jake felt a flicker of embarrassment. I'm sorry, I should have asked your name first. I'm terrible with protocol. The woman laughed softly, a sound that seemed genuine rather than polite. Perhaps that's not such a bad thing. What else do you think of the Lieutenant Commander? Over the next hour, Jake found himself talking more freely than he had in weeks. The woman asked thoughtful questions about Earth, about human culture and history. She seemed particularly interested in how humans governed themselves, how they resolved conflicts, and what they valued most. Jake, relieved to have a normal conversation after days of diplomatic, answered honestly. He talked about Earth's complicated history, about the mistakes humanity had made and the lessons they had learned. He talked about why Earth wanted to join the galactic community, not just for trade or technology, but to be part of something larger than themselves. The woman listened carefully to everything he said, occasionally asking a question that made Jake think more deeply about his own answers. She never volunteered much information about herself, and Jake, comfortable in what felt like an easy conversation, didn't push. As the reception began to wind down, the woman turned to leave. Will you be at the other functions this week? Jake asked. The next morning, Jake woke early to accompany Ambassador Vance to a private meeting with several trade officials. The meeting was held in a conference room deep within the station, and it quickly became clear that the negotiations were not going well. They spoke in careful, measured tones about humanity's lack of experience in galactic commerce. They questioned Earth's ability to meet trade standards, to maintain stable supply chains, to understand the complex web of agreements that governed interstellar exchange. Every concern was phrased politely, but the message was clear. Humans were too primitive to be taken seriously. Ambassador Vance remained patient, answering each objection with facts and figures about Earth's industrial capacity and resource management. But Jake could see the frustration in her eyes. They weren't really listening. They had already made up their minds. After 3 hours, the meeting adjourned with no progress. As they walked back to their quarters, Vance let out a long breath. They're going to reject our application, she said quietly. Not officially, not yet, but they'll delay and deflect until we give up or the other council members lose interest. Can we appeal to someone higher up? Jake asked. Vance shook her head. The people we met today are the highest officials who will speak to us. Anyone above them would consider it beneath their dignity to negotiate with a species that hasn't even colonized another star system yet. Jake wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He had seen the way they looked at the human delegation, like adults humoring children who were playing dress-up. That afternoon, there was another reception, this one less formal than the first. Jake stood near the refreshment area, watching the various alien species mingle. He felt out of place in his uniform, too rigid among the flowing robes and exotic clothing of the other delegates. Then he saw her again. The woman in simple clothes stood near the same window as before, looking out at the stars. Without thinking, Jake walked over to her. We meet again, he said. She turned and smiled. So we do. How are your negotiations progressing, Lieutenant Commander? Jake grimaced. That obvious. You look like someone who has spent the day being told no in very polite language. That's exactly what happened, Jake said. He paused, then decided to be honest. They think we're not ready. Maybe they're right. We've only been in space for a few decades. Most of these species have been traveling the stars for thousands of years. Time doesn't always equal wisdom, the woman said. What matters is what you do with your experience, not how long you've been gathering it. Jake looked at her curiously. You sound like you've thought about this a lot. I have, she said simply. They stood in silence for a moment, watching a massive cargo ship dock at one of the station's ports. Finally, Jake spoke again. Can I ask you something? What do you do here? I've seen you at both receptions, but you don't seem to be part of any official delegation. The woman's eyes sparkled with what looked like amusement. I observe, I listen, I learn what I can about the people who come to this station. That sounds like a diplomat's answer, Jake said with a laugh. Does it? She turned to face him fully. Tell me, what have you observed about during your time here? Jake considered his words carefully. They're proud, very focused on tradition and hierarchy. They've built something impressive, an empire that spans dozens of systems. But, the woman prompted. But I think their strength might also be their weakness, Jake said. They're so focused on maintaining order and following the old ways that they might miss new opportunities. And some of their policies seem harsh. The way they treat the species under their protection, for example. They call them client species, but it looks more like control than cooperation. You disapprove. I don't think it's my place to approve or disapprove, Jake said. I'm just a security officer. But yeah, if you're asking my personal opinion, I think any system that keeps other people dependent instead of helping them stand on their own is flawed. The woman nodded slowly, even if that system has maintained peace and stability for centuries. Peace and stability are important, Jake admitted, but not if they come at the cost of freedom and dignity. Humanity learned that the hard way. We spent thousands of years building empires and keeping people in chains, telling ourselves it was for their own good. It took a lot of suffering before we figured out that real strength comes from cooperation, not domination. And yet you're here, asking them to accept you into their system. We're not asking them to rule us, Jake said firmly. We're asking for the chance to trade, to share knowledge, to be part of the galactic community as equals. There's a difference between joining a partnership and submitting to an empire. The woman smiled. You speak very freely for someone whose mission depends on approval. Jake felt a flash of worry. Am I going to get in trouble for this conversation? That depends, the woman said. Do you regret being honest? No, Jake said after a moment. I'd rather fail while being honest than succeed by pretending to be something we're not. An admirable stance, the woman said, though perhaps not a practical one in galactic politics. They talked for another hour, and once again Jake found himself discussing things he probably shouldn't say out loud. But the woman was easy to talk to, and she asked questions that made him think. She never criticized his views or tried to change his mind, just listened and occasionally offered a different perspective. As the reception ended, Jake realized he still didn't know her name. I've been talking your ear off for 2 days now, he said, but I still don't know what to call you. Does it matter? She asked. I guess not, Jake said, but it feels rude. You may call me, she said. Jake repeated, that's a beautiful name. Thank you, she turned to leave, then paused. Lieutenant Commander, may I offer you some advice? Of course. Continue being honest. It's rarer than you might think, especially here. The next day brought more frustrating meetings. They continued to raise objections and concerns, always polite but never yielding. Ambassador Vance began to look tired, the stress of the negotiations wearing on her. That evening, Jake saw again at yet another function. This time, he brought her a drink and they found a quiet corner to talk. You're always alone at these things, Jake observed. Don't you have friends or colleagues here? I prefer to observe rather than participate, said. It gives me a clearer perspective. Sounds lonely. Sometimes, she admitted, but loneliness is the price of seeing things clearly. Jake looked at her more carefully. There was something about her that he couldn't quite figure out. The way she spoke, the questions she asked, the careful way she watched everything around her. She seemed too thoughtful, too measured to be a simple station worker. What do you really do here? He asked. She smiled. I already told you I observe and learn. That's not a real answer. Isn't it? She took a sip of her drink. Tell me, Lieutenant Commander, what do you think of me? Jake felt his face grow warm. I think you're intelligent and interesting. You ask good questions and actually listen to the answers. And, he hesitated. And you have the most beautiful figure I've seen since arriving at this station, Jake said, then immediately felt embarrassed. Sorry, that was inappropriate. Laughed, a genuine sound that drew a few curious glances from nearby aliens. Why apologize for a compliment? Because we barely know each other, and I'm supposed to be professional. Do you always say what you think, even when it's not professional? More often than I should, Jake admitted. I find that refreshing, said. She looked at him thoughtfully. Tell me something, Lieutenant Commander. When you look at me, what do you see? Jake considered the question. I see someone who doesn't quite fit in, someone who's watching the world from the outside, someone who, he paused, searching for the right words, someone who seems like they're waiting for something. Waiting for what? I don't know. Maybe for someone to see past whatever role they're supposed to play. His expression changed, becoming more serious. And you think you see past my role? I think you're more than you appear to be, Jake said. But I also think maybe that's what you want people to miss. Before could respond, Commander Harper appeared at Jake's elbow, her face tense. The ambassador needs to see you immediately. Jake excused himself and followed Harper through the station corridors. They entered Vance's quarters to find the ambassador packing, her usual calm completely gone. Tell me exactly who you've been talking to at these receptions, Vance demanded. Various people, Jake said, confused. Why? Describe the woman you were just speaking with. Jake described, and with each word, Vance's face grew paler. The simple gray clothes, she asked. Yes. Standing apart from the main groups. Yes, Ambassador, what's going on? Vance sat down heavily. That woman you've been having casual conversations with, the one you just complimented on her figure, is Empress. She's the absolute ruler of the Empire. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. That's not possible. She was dressed like a servant, she never said. Traditional rulers wear simple clothes when they want to observe without the burden of ceremony, Vance said. It's an ancient custom, and you've been treating her like a station worker for 3 days. Jake's mind raced back through every conversation, every casual comment, every criticism of policy he had made. He had told the Empress of the Empire that her government's policies were harsh. He had criticized their treatment of client species. He had complimented her appearance like she was someone he met at a bar. I've ruined everything, he said quietly. The Imperial chamber was enormous. Jake had never seen a room so large inside a space station. The ceiling stretched up at least 50 meters, covered in intricate designs that seemed to shift and move in the light. Columns lined the walls, each one carved from a single piece of dark stone that gleamed like metal. At the far end of the chamber, on a raised platform, sat the Empress. Looked completely different from the woman Jake had spoken with at the receptions. She wore robes of deep purple and silver that flowed around her like water. A crown of thin metal rested on her head, so delicate it looked like it would break at the slightest touch. Dozens of officials stood in formation around the platform, all wearing formal attire that made their previous elaborate robes look simple by comparison. The human delegation walked forward in a tight group, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Ambassador Vance led them, her face calm but her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Jake walked beside her, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. They stopped at the base of the platform, as instructed. An official, his robes covered in golden symbols, stepped forward. You stand before Empress, ruler of the Empire, keeper of the ancient ways, guardian of 17 star systems and 43 inhabited worlds. You will show proper respect. The humans bowed, as they had been taught. When they straightened, was watching them with an expression Jake couldn't read. Ambassador Vance said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber. You come before me to petition for humanity's entry into the Galactic Trade Consortium. Yes, Your Imperial Majesty, Vance said. We seek only the opportunity to prove ourselves worthy of membership. Worthy, repeated. An interesting word. Tell me what makes a species worthy. Vance began to speak about Earth's resources and industrial capacity, but raised a hand to stop her. I have read your reports, Ambassador. I know what Earth can produce. I'm asking a different question. What makes any species worthy of respect, of trust, of partnership? The chamber fell silent. Vance opened her mouth, then closed it, unsure how to answer. Perhaps your security officer has an opinion, said, her eyes moving to Jake. Lieutenant Commander, you've been quite vocal about your views. Please share them with my court. Jake felt every eye in the chamber turn toward him. He glanced at Vance, who gave him a tiny nod. Whatever he said now could make things better or worse, but there was no avoiding it. I think worthiness comes from actions, not capabilities, Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. Any species can be strong or wealthy, but being worthy means using that strength to build rather than destroy. It means treating others with dignity, even when you don't have to. It means choosing cooperation over domination. A murmur ran through the officials. Several looked offended. The official with the golden robe stepped forward. You speak of cooperation and dignity while insulting our Empress, he said sharply. For 3 days, you treated her Imperial Majesty as if she were a common servant. You criticized our government's policies to her face. You even— He paused, as if the words were difficult to say. You complimented her physical appearance as if she were some casual acquaintance. The official's voice rose. These are grave insults to protocol and tradition. The Empire demands proper respect from those who seek our favor. Your behavior shows that humanity is not ready to join civilized society. More murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jake felt his stomach sink. The official was right. By standards, everything he had done was an insult. But then spoke. Lord, you have accurately described Lieutenant Commander's actions. Now let me describe their context. She stood, and the entire chamber fell silent. I wore the traditional garments of observation specifically to see how your delegation would behave without the weight of ceremony. Most species recognize these garments and adjust their behavior accordingly, showing me a false face even in supposedly casual settings. She walked down the steps of the platform, moving toward the human delegation. The officials shifted nervously, clearly not expecting this. Lieutenant Commander did not recognize the garments. He saw a person standing alone at a reception and engaged in simple conversation. He was honest about his views, even when those views were critical of our government. He treated me with basic courtesy, not because he knew who I was, but because he treats everyone that way. Stopped a few feet from Jake, looking directly at him. For 3 days, I asked you the same question. Do you know me? You answered honestly each time. No, you didn't know my identity, but you tried to see who I was as a person beyond titles and appearances. That is something I rarely experience. She turned to address the full chamber. I have been Empress for 42 years. In that time, I have spoken with thousands of diplomats, nobles, and officials. Do you know how many of them have told me the truth, even when it contradicted my government's policies? How many have shown me the courtesy of honest conversation rather than calculated flattery? The chamber remained silent. None, said. Not one. They tell me what they think I want to hear. They praise our traditions while privately mocking them. They bow and scrape and call me wise, then leave and curse our restrictions. Lieutenant Commander criticized our client species system to my face, clearly believing I was someone who had no power to change it. He was wrong about my identity, but right about the policy. Lord stepped forward again. Your Majesty, with respect, this human spoke out of ignorance. Once he learns our ways, he will fall into the same patterns as everyone else. Perhaps, said, or perhaps humanity offers something we desperately need, a fresh perspective. Lord, when was the last time anyone in this court questioned our policies? When did anyone suggest that our ancient traditions might need updating for modern times? Tradition has served us well for thousands of years, said stiffly. Has it? Turned to face her officials. Then why do the petition for autonomy every cycle? Why do 3 client species have active independence movements? Why do we spend more resources maintaining control than we gain from their tribute? The officials shifted uncomfortably. Clearly, these were not questions that were usually asked in open court. I have wanted to reform our client species system for decades, continued. But every time I raised the possibility, my advisors warned that it would make us appear weak, that our enemies would see it as a sign that our empire was failing. So I remained silent, maintaining policies I knew were unjust because I feared the political consequences of change. She looked back at Jake. Then a human security officer, believing he was speaking to someone with no power, told me that real strength comes from cooperation, not domination. That keeping people dependent instead of helping them stand on their own is flawed. And I realized he was right, not because he was clever or diplomatic, but because he was honest. Returned to her platform and sat down. Here is my decision. The human delegation's petition to join the Galactic Trade Consortium is approved, but I have a condition. Ambassador Vance bowed. We will meet any reasonable condition, Your Majesty. I want humanity to evaluate the situation and provide recommendations for reform, not as subordinates seeking approval, but as equals offering an outside perspective. You will have full access to all records and the freedom to interview anyone you wish. Your report will be presented to this court in 1 week. The chamber erupted. Officials began speaking over each other, their voices rising in protest. This was clearly unprecedented. Your Majesty, said loudly, with great respect, this is madness. The matter is an internal affair. We cannot allow an outside species, especially one with no experience in galactic politics, to interfere. I'm not asking for permission, Lord, said coldly. I'm informing you of my decision. If humanity's assessment confirms that our current system is just and proper, then nothing will change. But if they find what I suspect they will find, then reforms will be implemented. She stood again, and this time her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. I am Empress. My word is law. This matter is settled. The officials fell silent, though their expressions showed clear disapproval. Looked at the human delegation. Ambassador Vance, you and your team will be given quarters in the diplomatic section and full access to our records. I expect honest assessment, not political calculation. Is that understood? Perfectly, Your Majesty, Vance said, bowing deeply. Good, you are dismissed. The human delegation filed out of the chamber, not speaking until they were well away from the Imperial section. Once they were safely in their own quarters, Vance let out a long breath. Well, she said, looking at Jake, that was unexpected. I'm sorry, Ambassador, Jake said. I should have been more careful. More careful about what? Vance asked. About being honest, about treating someone with basic respect. Jake, you did something I've been trying to do for 3 weeks. You made actual contact with the person who makes decisions, not the wall of bureaucrats around her. But I criticized their government to her face. Yes, you did, and apparently that's exactly what she needed to hear. Vance sat down, looking thoughtful. The Empress just gave us an incredible opportunity. If we handle this assessment correctly, we won't just gain entry to the Trade Consortium. We'll establish humanity's reputation as a species that speaks truth and values justice. That's worth more than any trade agreement. Commander Harper, who had been quiet throughout the audience, finally spoke. Do you think she's testing us? Maybe she expects us to side with the to curry favor. Maybe, Vance said, but I don't think so. She seemed genuine about wanting reform. Either the district occupied a lower section of Zenith 7, far from the gleaming halls where the major powers conducted their business. Jake and Ambassador Vance walked through corridors that showed signs of age and neglect. The lighting was dimmer here, and the air had a recycled smell that suggested the environmental systems weren't maintained as well as in other parts of the station. A representative named Myra waited for them at the district entrance. She was shorter than with reddish-brown fur and large eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When she saw the humans, she clasped her hands together in what they had learned was a gesture of respectful greeting. Ambassador Vance, Lieutenant Commander, welcome. We were told you wished to learn about our people. We do, Vance said. We want to understand your situation and hear your perspectives. Myra led them through the district, showing them the living areas, work facilities, and communal spaces where they lived. Everything was clean and functional, but there was a sense of constraint that Jake couldn't quite define. It took him a while to realize what it was. Nothing seemed new. The equipment was old, the furniture worn, the technology at least a generation behind what he had seen in the sections. How long have they been part of the Empire? Jake asked. 347 years, Myra said. Our world was integrated into the Empire during the expansion period. We were told it was for our protection. Protection from what? Myra's ears flattened slightly, a sign of discomfort. That was never made entirely clear. There were no active threats to our world at the time, but they insisted that as a younger species, we needed their guidance and security. Over the next 3 days, the human delegation interviewed dozens of. They reviewed records of petitions submitted to the government over the centuries. They examined trade agreements, resource allocations, and educational restrictions. A picture began to emerge that made Jake increasingly uncomfortable. They were not slaves or prisoners. They were fed, housed, and provided with basic services, but they were kept in a state of permanent dependency. They couldn't own property outside their designated districts. They couldn't pursue advanced education without approval, which was rarely granted. They couldn't trade directly with other species or travel freely through the Empire. They worked in positions that considered beneath them, always supervised, never trusted with real responsibility. On the fourth day, Jake sat in a small cafe in the district, reviewing his notes. A young named who worked as a maintenance technician sat across from him. "Let me ask you something," said. "What would happen if a human wanted to become an engineer or a doctor or a ship captain?" "They would study and train," Jake said. "If they were good enough, they would get the position. And no one would tell them they couldn't because of what species they were born as. No, there are plenty of obstacles in life, but species isn't one of them. Not on Earth, anyway." Nodded slowly. "I wanted to be an engineer. I studied the manuals on my own, learned everything I could about ship systems and power distribution. I submitted an application to the Technical Institute 3 times. Each time I was told that we're not ready for such complex responsibilities, that we should focus on our traditional roles." "What are your traditional roles?" Jake asked. "Maintenance, cleaning, basic labor. Anything that keeps the Empire running but doesn't require trust or authority." His voice was bitter. "We've been ready for 300 years, but admitting that would mean admitting they were wrong to keep us dependent for so long." That evening, Jake found Vance in her quarters, surrounded by reports and data files. "This isn't protection," Jake said without preamble. "It's control. They are keeping the down to maintain their own sense of superiority." "I know," Vance said quietly. "The question is what we put in our report. The truth, that they are perfectly capable of governing themselves and have been for centuries. That the current system serves no purpose except to make them feel important. If we say that, we risk offending the very people we're trying to build a relationship with." Jake sat down heavily. "So what do we do? Lie? Tell them their system is fine just to make them happy?" "No," Vance said firmly. "We tell the truth, asked for honest assessment, and that's what you'll get. But we need to be smart about how we present it. We're not trying to attack them. We're trying to show them a better path forward." The next morning, a servant arrived with an unexpected message. Empress requested a private meeting with Lieutenant Commander. Just the two of them, no officials or advisors present. Jake found waiting in a small garden area, one of the few places on the station with actual plants and open space. She stood near a fountain, wearing simple clothes again, looking more like the woman he had met at the reception than the Empress who had commanded the Imperial Chamber. "Thank you for coming," she said as he approached. "Your Majesty," Jake said, bowing. "We're alone, Lieutenant Commander. You can dispense with the formality." Jake straightened, feeling awkward. "I'm still getting used to the fact that I spent 3 days complaining about your government to your face." Smiled slightly. "How is your investigation progressing?" "It's enlightening," Jake said carefully. "You've discovered that our treatment of thee is unjust." It wasn't a question. Jake nodded. "Yes. I could have told you that myself," said. "I've known for years, but knowing and having the power to change are different things." She gestured to a bench near the fountain. "Sit with me. I want to tell you something." They sat and looked out at the small garden. "When I became Empress, I was young and full of idealistic plans. I wanted to reform the client species system, to modernize our laws, to make the Empire more just. Do you know what happened? The nobles resisted. They did more than resist. 3 of the most powerful houses threatened to secede from the Empire. They said I was destroying our traditions, weakening our strength, dishonoring our ancestors. I had a choice: push forward and risk civil war, or compromise and wait for a better opportunity. You compromised." "I did. I told myself it was the wise choice, that stability was more important than rapid change. But years passed, and the better opportunity never came. The nobles grew stronger, more entrenched in their positions, and I grew tired of fighting." Turned to look at Jake. "Do you know what the worst part is? I became comfortable with the injustice. Not because I thought it was right, but because acknowledging it would mean admitting I had been wrong to compromise, that I had wasted decades maintaining a system I knew was flawed." "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked. Because you asked me a question 3 days ago and I want to answer it properly. His eyes met his. You asked if I knew who you were, but I've been asking you the same thing. Do you know me? Do you understand what it means to have absolute power and still feel powerless? To be surrounded by advisors who tell you only what you want to hear? To make decisions that affect millions of lives and wonder if you're choosing based on wisdom or fear? I'm just a security officer, Jake said. I don't know anything about ruling an empire. No, but you know about being honest even when it's difficult. About standing up for what's right even when it would be easier to stay silent. Those are the qualities I've lost sight of. She paused. When you criticized our client species system, you said that real strength comes from cooperation, not domination. Where did you learn that? Jake thought about his answer. From history, I guess. Humanity spent most of our existence building empires and keeping people in chains. We told ourselves it was for their own good, that we were bringing civilization to primitive peoples. But really, we were just afraid. Afraid that if we treated others as equals, we might not be as special as we thought we were. And how did that change? Slowly, painfully. It took wars and rebellions and centuries of suffering before we finally figured out that strength doesn't come from how many people you control. It comes from how many people choose to stand beside you, from trust and cooperation and mutual respect. Nodded slowly. They have been petitioning for autonomy for generations. Every time my advisors tell me that granting it would make us look weak, that other client species would demand the same treatment, that our empire would crumble. Maybe it would, Jake said. Or maybe it would transform into something better, something based on alliance instead of control. That's what I want to believe, said quietly. But I'm afraid, not of losing power, but of being wrong again, of making another choice that leads to more suffering. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Jake spoke. Can I tell you what I see when I look at you now? Smiled faintly, yes. I see someone who cares deeply about doing the right thing, but has been trapped by circumstances and politics for so long that she's forgotten how to take the first step. I see someone with the power to change the galaxy, but afraid that change will break what she's spent decades building. And I see someone who's tired of being alone in that fear. You see all that? I'm probably wrong about half of it, Jake admitted. But I think the part about being tired of being alone is true. That's why you kept asking if I knew you. Not because you wanted recognition or respect, but because you wanted someone to see past the crown and the power to the person underneath. His eyes glistened slightly. You're not wrong. In 42 years as Empress, you're the first person who has tried to know me rather than what I represent. Then I'll answer your question, Jake said. Yes, I know you, maybe not completely, but enough to know that you're trying to do better, that you want your empire to be more than it is. That's worth something. Stood and Jake rose with her. She looked at him for a long moment, then extended her hand in a very human gesture. Jake shook it and she smiled. Your report will recommend full autonomy for the... Yes. Good, I'll support it. And I'll use your assessment as justification for broader reforms across all client species. The nobles won't like it. No, agreed. But for the first time in decades, I don't care. You reminded me of something important, Lieutenant Commander. True leadership isn't about maintaining power. It's about using that power to make things better even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Imperial Chamber was even more crowded than it had been during the first audience. Word had spread throughout the station that the human delegation would present their assessment of the situation, and it seemed like every species with an interest in policy had sent representatives. Jake stood beside Ambassador Vance at the base of the platform, holding a data tablet with their final report. He could feel the weight of countless eyes on them, some curious, some hostile, all waiting to see what the humans would say. Empress sat on her throne, dressed in full imperial regalia. Her face showed no emotion, giving no hint of what she was thinking. Lord and the other senior nobles stood to her right, their expressions making it clear they expected the humans to either confirm the current system or embarrass themselves trying to change it. Ambassador Vance, said, her voice carrying through the chamber, you have completed your assessment of the situation. Present your findings. Vance stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. Your Imperial Majesty, members of the court, we have spent the past week studying the people, their history, and their current status within the Empire. We have reviewed official records, conducted extensive interviews, and examined the practical realities of their daily lives. Our conclusion is straightforward. They are fully capable of self-governance and have been for centuries. A murmur ran through the crowd. Lord's expression hardened, but he remained silent. Vance continued. We found no evidence that they lacked the intelligence, organization, or cultural development necessary to manage their own affairs. In fact, we found substantial evidence to the contrary. They have maintained complex social structures, educational systems, and community governance within the constraints imposed on them. When given responsibility, even in limited contexts, they have consistently demonstrated competence and reliability. She activated her tablet, displaying data on large screens around the chamber. The current system restricts access to advanced education, property ownership, and professional advancement. These restrictions are not based on demonstrated incapacity, but on assumptions made centuries ago. Our interviews revealed numerous cases of individuals who possess the skills and knowledge for advanced positions, but are prevented from pursuing them solely because of their species. Lord finally spoke. Ambassador, with respect, you are making judgments about a relationship that has existed for over 3 centuries. The system provides stability and protection. Changing it would create chaos. We anticipated that concern, Vance said, which is why we're not recommending immediate, uncontrolled change. We propose a structured transition to full autonomy over a period of 3 years. During this time, they would gradually assume control of their own governance, with support and resources available to ensure a smooth transition. Jake activated his tablet, displaying a detailed timeline. Year 1 would focus on establishing governmental structures and transferring administrative responsibilities. Year 2 would expand their economic independence, allowing them to engage in direct trade and manage their own resources. Year 3 would complete the transition, with the becoming a fully autonomous client state with the option to remain associated with the Empire through mutual agreement rather than imposed control. The chamber erupted into discussion. Some species representatives looked intrigued, others shocked. The nobles spoke urgently among themselves, their voices rising. This is madness, another noble declared. If we grant the autonomy, every client species will demand the same. Our empire will collapse. Perhaps it should, Jake said, and the chamber fell silent. He hadn't meant to speak, but the words came out before he could stop them. Every eye turned to him, and he felt his heart race. But he had started, so he continued. If an empire can only survive by keeping people dependent against their will, maybe it doesn't deserve to survive. Vance said quietly, a warning in her voice. But raised a hand. Let him speak. Jake took a breath. I'm not a diplomat or a politician, I'm just a security officer. But I've spent the past week talking to them, hearing their stories, seeing how they live, and I've also studied your empire's history. They have achieved incredible things. You've built a civilization that spans star systems, maintained peace for centuries, preserved knowledge and culture. Those are real accomplishments. He looked directly at the nobles. But accomplishments aren't the same as strength. Real strength doesn't come from how many people you control or how much power you have over others. It comes from how you treat those who can't defend themselves, from whether you choose to lift people up or keep them down. Right now, your empire is choosing to keep people down and calling it protection. Lord stepped forward angrily. You dare lecture us about strength? Your species has barely left your own star system. You know nothing of the responsibilities of empire. You're right, Jake said. Humanity is young compared to we don't have your history or your achievements, but we do have our own history of mistakes. We spent thousands of years building empires and enslaving people, telling ourselves it was for their own good. And it took countless wars and rebellions and suffering before we finally learned the truth, that you can't build lasting peace on injustice. That systems based on control and domination eventually fall apart, no matter how strong they seem. He gestured to the data on the screens. They aren't asking for charity or special treatment. They're asking for the chance to stand on their own, to succeed or fail based on their own choices. Denying them that doesn't make you strong. It makes you afraid. Afraid, his voice was ice. Of what? Of being wrong, Jake said simply. Of admitting that maybe the system your ancestors created isn't perfect, that maybe times have changed and the old ways need to change with them. That's terrifying, I get it. Change is always scary, but you know what's scarier? Staying the same while the galaxy moves forward around you. The chamber was completely silent now. Jake could feel Vance's tension beside him, knew he had probably gone too far, but he couldn't take the words back, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. Stood, Lieutenant Commander speaks with passion, if not with diplomacy, but his words deserve consideration. Lord, you say that granting the autonomy would lead other client species to demand the same. I say, let them. Gasps echoed through the chamber. The nobles stared at their empress in shock. For 42 years, I have ruled this empire by maintaining tradition and avoiding conflict, continued. I told myself it was wise leadership, that stability was more important than justice. But stability built on injustice is not strength. It's fear dressed up as wisdom. She walked down from the platform, something that clearly shocked her court. The human delegation has shown us something we should have seen ourselves. The client species system is outdated and unjust. It serves no purpose except to make us feel superior to others. That is not the foundation of a great empire. It's the foundation of a dying one. Your Majesty, said, his voice strained, I must protest. This decision could have severe consequences. It will have consequences, agreed. The question is whether we choose consequences we control or wait for consequences forced upon us. I choose action. She turned to address the full chamber. I hereby decree that there will be granted full autonomy according to the timeline proposed by the human delegation. Furthermore, I am establishing a review commission to evaluate the status of all client species within the empire. Those who wish autonomy will be granted it. Those who wish to remain associated with the empire will do so as free partners, not subordinates. The chamber erupted into chaos. Nobles shouted protests, client species representatives looked shocked, and ambassadors from other powers watched with amazement. Raised her hand, and slowly the noise died down. This is not a discussion, she said firmly. This is an imperial decree. It will be implemented. Any noble house that objects may petition for review through proper channels, but the fundamental decision stands. She looked at the human delegation. Humanity has shown us a mirror, and we owe them gratitude for that. Their petition to join the Galactic Trade Consortium is approved with full privileges. Furthermore, I am establishing a formal alliance between the Empire and Earth, recognizing them as valued partners in galactic affairs. Lord looked like he wanted to argue further, but one glance at his face made him reconsider. He bowed stiffly and stepped back. This audience is concluded, announced. The Empire has much work to do. 3 days later, Jake stood at the observation window in the human delegation's quarters, watching ships come and go from the station. Ambassador Vance joined him, 2 glasses in hand. She offered one to Jake. To successful diplomacy, she said with a slight smile. I'm pretty sure I violated every rule of diplomacy, Jake said, taking the glass. Probably, but you got results, which is what matters. Vance looked out at the stars. News is spreading fast. 3 other client species have already petitioned for autonomy. 2 more are drafting proposals. The Empire is about to transform itself, whether the nobles like it or not. Do you think it will work? Honestly, I don't know. Change is messy and complicated. Some client species might struggle with autonomy. Some noble houses might cause problems, but it's the right choice even if it's difficult. A soft chime indicated someone at the door. Jake answered it to find a servant holding a small package. For Lieutenant Commander, the servant said, bowing, from Her Imperial Majesty. Jake took the package, confused. Inside was a simple bracelet made of woven metal, elegant but not ornate. There was also a note in his handwriting. You asked if I knew you, and you asked the same of me. The answer is yes. This bracelet is a traditional gift given to someone who has shown you truth when others show only flattery. Wear it as a reminder that honesty is more valuable than power, and that seeing people clearly is more important than seeing their position. Thank you for treating me as a person first and an empress second. That gift is rarer than you know. Jake read the note twice, then carefully put the bracelet on his wrist. What is it? Vance asked. A reminder, Jake said quietly. That evening, there was a private farewell dinner with several officials, including Empress. The atmosphere was more relaxed than any previous gathering, though still formal by human standards. Found a moment to speak with Jake privately. You're leaving tomorrow, she said. Yes, the ambassador has other diplomatic missions to complete. Will you return to Zenith 7? Probably not for a while. Earth is a long way from here. Nodded. Then I want to thank you one more time, not as an empress thanking a diplomat, but as a person thanking a friend. You gave me the courage to make changes I should have made decades ago. I just told you what I saw, Jake said. No, you did more than that. You saw me clearly when I had forgotten how to see myself. You reminded me that being a leader means being honest, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." She smiled slightly. "And your comment about my figure, while highly inappropriate by our standards, reminded me that I am more than just my title. I had forgotten that." Jake felt his face warm. "I'm still sorry about that." "Don't be, it was honest, and honesty is what I needed." She extended her hand, and Jake shook it. "The galaxy is changing, Lieutenant Commander. Species like yours are bringing new perspectives, challenging old assumptions. Some of us fear that change, but I choose to welcome it. Your humanity showed us a better path forward." "I hope we can live up to that," Jake said. "You already have." The next morning, the human delegation boarded their ship for the journey home. As they prepared to depart, Jake looked back at Zenith 7 one last time. Somewhere on that station, Myra and the other were beginning to plan for a future of freedom. Somewhere, Empress sat on her throne, implementing reforms that would reshape her empire. And somewhere, other species watched and wondered what this new relationship between humanity and the would mean for the galaxy. Ambassador Vance sat down beside Jake in the observation lounge. "You know what the strangest part of this whole experience was?" she asked. "What?" "You spent 3 days talking to the most powerful person in a dozen star systems and didn't even realize it. Most diplomats spend their whole careers trying to get 5 minutes of face time with someone like that." Jake laughed. "I guess ignorance has its advantages. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe you just treated everyone the same, regardless of who they were or what power they held. That's not ignorance, Jake. That's integrity." As the ship pulled away from the station and jumped into faster-than-light travel, Jake touched the bracelet on his wrist. He thought about his question, "Do you know me?" He understood now what she had really been asking. Not whether he knew her name or title, but whether he could see her as a person beneath all the ceremony and power. Whether he could recognize her struggles, her fears, her desire to do better. And he had, simply by treating her with the same respect and honesty he would show anyone else. Humanity's reputation spread through the galaxy in the months that followed. They were the species that spoke truth to power without even realizing it. That valued honesty over political gain. That treated everyone with dignity, from the lowest maintenance worker to the highest empress. It all started because one human officer struck up a conversation with a stranger at a reception, complimented her figure without knowing she ruled an empire, and criticized her government's policies to her face. And somehow, against all odds, that casual honesty had changed the galaxy. In the end, had asked the right question, "Do you know me?" And Jake had answered it the only way that mattered, by seeing her clearly, treating her honestly, and reminding her that beneath every title and position, there's a person who needs to be seen for who they really are. That was the gift humanity brought to the stars. Not superior technology or military might, but the simple belief that every person deserves respect, every voice deserves to be heard, and every empire should be judged not by its power, but by how it treats those who have none. And sometimes, that belief is enough to transform a galaxy. She turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you for the conversation, both the ones where you knew who I was and the ones where you didn't. I needed both." As Jake watched her walk away, he thought about the strange path that had led him here. A casual conversation at a reception, meant to pass the time, had somehow changed the course of an empire, and all because he had treated a stranger with kindness and honesty, never realizing the power she held. We do what humans do best. We look at the situation honestly and report what we find, regardless of politics. Jake stood at the window, looking out at the stars. Somewhere on this station, the waited, probably not knowing that their fate was now tied to humanity's first major diplomatic mission. And somewhere in the Imperial section, sat on her throne, having just made a decision that would either transform her empire or create a political crisis. All because Jake had treated a stranger with kindness, never guessing she ruled millions of lives. "Possibly," Vance said. "We have a formal audience with her tomorrow morning. I suggest you spend tonight preparing an apology." But as Jake lay in his quarters that night, staring at the ceiling, he kept hearing's voice asking him the same question. "Do you know me?" He finally understood what she had been asking. Not whether he knew her name or title, but whether he could see who she really was beneath all of that. And he had answered honestly, never realizing he was speaking to someone who could destroy humanity's hopes with a single word. Tomorrow, he would find out if honesty had been enough. She looked back at him with that same slight smile. Yes, I believe I will be. Good, Jake said. It's nice to talk to someone who doesn't treat me like I might break something important just by existing. The woman's smile grew wider. The week is young, Lieutenant Commander. Perhaps you will break something important. She walked away before Jake could ask what she meant, disappearing into the crowd of departing aliens. Jake stood there for a moment, then shook his head and went to rejoin the human delegation. He had no idea that his casual conversation had just changed the course of human history.